Every case leaves a trace, a name, a date, a question that was never answered. This is Silent Shadows. Late on the night of February 28, 1905, Jane Lathrop Stanford lay rigid in a room at Honolulu's Mona Hotel. Only minutes earlier she had swallowed bicarbonate of soda to settle her stomach. Now her muscles were convulsing, her jaw was tightening, and physicians were rushing to save her. Jane reportedly understood what was happening. She believed she had been poisoned, and this was not the first time, 6 weeks earlier. Someone had apparently tried to kill her inside her own San Francisco mansion. She survived that first attempt, left California, and sailed for Hawaii, hoping distance might bring safety and calm. Instead, she died there. A coroner's jury would call her death a deliberate poisoning, but Stanford University's president soon promoted a very different explanation. So how did a murder finding become an unsolved historical controversy? To understand why Jane Stanford's death mattered so much, we need to back up. Jane and her husband, Leland Stanford, had built an enormous fortune during California's rapid 19th century expansion. Leland became a railroad executive, governor, and United States senator. But the defining event of their private lives was not political or financial. It was the death of their only child, Leland Stanford Jr. Their son died from typhoid fever in 1884 while the family was traveling in Europe. He was only 15. Grief reshaped the Stanfords' lives, and they decided to create a university in his memory. Stanford University opened in 1891. When Leland Stanford died 2 years later, Jane became the institution's principal surviving founder, benefactor, and in many practical ways, its financial guardian. That role gave Jane extraordinary influence. She was not simply an elderly donor whose name appeared on buildings. Her decisions affected university budgets, faculty positions, construction, and leadership. She could be generous, deeply involved, and intensely protective of what she believed was her son's memorial. By 1905, she was 76 years old, wealthy, prominent, and surrounded by people whose futures could be changed by her choices. On January 14th, Jane was at her mansion on Nob Hill in San Francisco. During the night, she drank from a bottle of mineral water kept in her room. The taste was immediately wrong. It was sharply bitter, so unpleasant that she spat or vomited much of it back up. She became ill but survived. At first, this might have looked like contamination or a spoiled household product. Then the water was tested. The laboratory result changed everything. Strychnine was found in the bottle. This was not a harmless impurity. Strychnine is an intensely bitter poison that attacks the nervous system, removing the body's normal restraint on muscle contractions. A victim can suffer violent, painful spasms while remaining conscious. Even a small quantity can be fatal. The bitter taste that had warned Jane may also have saved her life. Now here's where it gets strange. The poisoned bottle had been inside Jane's home, apparently among ordinary household supplies. That raised frightening questions about access. Who could enter her room? Who handled her food, medicine, and water? Was the bottle poisoned before it arrived or after it entered the mansion? Investigators questioned members of the household, but the inquiry did not identify a culprit or establish a clear chain of events. Jane took the incident seriously. She believed someone had tried to murder her and given the laboratory finding. That fear was hardly irrational, yet her response was not to remain in San Francisco under guard while investigators worked. She continued with plans to travel. On February 15th, barely a month after the mineral water episode, she sailed for Hawaii aboard a passenger ship, accompanied by her secretary and her maid. Why leave after an apparent poisoning? Accounts suggest Jane wanted rest and relief from the strain surrounding her. Travel was familiar to wealthy Americans of her era, and Hawaii offered distance from San Francisco's pressures. Perhaps she thought the danger was connected to the mansion. Perhaps she believed the person responsible could not reach her at sea or in Honolulu. Whatever her reasoning, she did not escape the threat. Jane arrived in Honolulu and stayed at the Mona Hotel on Waikiki. At the time, the Mona was a grand, relatively new resort, designed to offer comfort and refinement at the edge of the Pacific. The setting could hardly have seemed further from the dark rooms of her Nob Hill residence. For several days, nothing happened. Jane visited local sites, made plans, and appeared to continue her journey normally. Then came February 28th. That evening, Jane attended dinner and later returned to her hotel room. She complained of stomach discomfort and asked for bicarbonate of soda, a common household remedy used for indigestion. The powder came from a bottle in her possession. Her secretary prepared or provided it with water, and Jane swallowed the mixture. Almost at once, she noticed an alarming bitterness. The reaction developed rapidly. Jane began to suffer muscular stiffness and violent convulsions. Her body arched and tightened. Her jaw became difficult to control, and ordinary movement or stimulation could intensify the spasms. These were not vague symptoms remembered years later. They were observed during the emergency by people in the room and by physicians summoned to the hotel. Jane reportedly said she had been poisoned again. The doctors attempted to control the convulsions, but medicine in 1905 had limited options. Strychnine poisoning can interfere with breathing as the muscles contract uncontrollably. The heart may continue beating while the victim becomes unable to breathe effectively. Jane's condition worsened quickly, and shortly before midnight she died in the hotel room. The entire collapse had unfolded over a matter of minutes. For the people around her, the obvious connection was the January incident. In San Francisco, Jane had tasted bitter water, and testing had confirmed strychnine. In Honolulu, she swallowed another bitter mixture and developed symptoms strongly associated with the same poison. Two separate containers in two distant places had apparently delivered the same substance to the same woman. Coincidence now seemed extraordinarily difficult to accept. Honolulu authorities opened an inquest. Physicians described the symptoms they had witnessed, and the bicarbonate bottle was examined. Chemical analysis indicated that it contained strychnine. Investigators also had to consider whether the poison could have been present accidentally, perhaps through careless storage or a manufacturing error. But bicarbonate of soda does not naturally contain strychnine, and the earlier poisoned water made innocent contamination even less convincing. On March 9th, the coroner's jury reached its conclusion. Jane Stanford had died from strychnine poisoning, and the poison had been deliberately introduced into the bicarbonate bottle by a person or persons unknown. In plain language, the jury found that she had been murdered. It did not identify the killer, but it rejected natural illness and accident as explanations for the evidence placed before it. At that point, you might expect an expanding investigation linking Honolulu to San Francisco. Detectives could compare access to both containers, examine the movements of everyone near Jane, and trace who possessed or purchased strychnine. But the case soon moved into a more complicated arena. Jane was not only a murder victim. She was the surviving founder of a major university, and her death created financial and institutional consequences. David Starr Jordan, the president of Stanford University, traveled to Honolulu after Jane's death. Jordan had led the university since its opening and had worked with Jane through years of financial difficulty and internal disagreement. Their relationship was complicated. They shared an interest in Stanford's survival, but Jane's direct involvement sometimes conflicted with Jordan's vision and authority. Her decisions could determine which professors stayed and how money was spent. Jordan did not accept the murder conclusion. He promoted an alternative explanation centered on natural causes, particularly heart failure brought on by age, exertion, or digestive distress. Supporters of that view pointed to Jane's health, her activities, and the possibility that frightening symptoms had been misinterpreted. Jordan later presented the natural death theory publicly, helping create uncertainty around what Honolulu's physicians and coroner's jury had concluded. But there was an immediate problem with that alternative. Natural heart failure did not explain the strychnine reportedly detected in the bicarbonate bottle, nor did it explain the confirmed poison in the mineral water from January. Even if Jane had underlying heart disease, that would not make two bitter household substances acquire strychnine on their own. The natural death argument had to minimize not just one medical episode, but a connected pattern. Jordan was not a physician, and his intervention has remained controversial. Some historians believe he was primarily protecting Stanford University from scandal. A murder investigation could damage the institution's reputation, disrupt control of Jane's estate, and invite hostile attention to internal conflicts. Others caution that institutional self-interest does not prove criminal involvement. Jordan may genuinely have believed the poisoning diagnosis was mistaken, even if that belief now appears difficult to defend. This distinction matters. There is a large gap between saying Jordan helped weaken the murder inquiry and saying he participated in Jane's death. No conclusive evidence placed him near either poisoned container, and no court ever tested a case against him. His potential institutional motive has fueled suspicion. But motive alone is not proof. The historical record supports hard questions about his response, not a confident accusation that he arranged a killing. Attention also fell on the people physically closest to Jane. Her secretary and maid traveled with her, entered her rooms, and handled personal items. Household employees in San Francisco likewise had access to food, water, and medicine. Yet access was not exclusive. Bottles could pass through multiple hands. And the surviving records do not establish when either dose was added. Suspicion spread widely, but evidence did not settle on one person. There were possible motives beyond university politics. Jane controlled substantial wealth and was considering decisions involving employees, beneficiaries, and Stanford's future. Anyone expecting dismissal, inheritance, favor, or financial advantage could appear suspicious after the fact, but this creates another trap. A wealthy victim often leaves behind many people who might benefit in some indirect way. Unless motive connects to opportunity and physical evidence, it remains speculation. The mechanics of the crime are equally puzzling. Was the January poisoner also responsible in Honolulu? The repeated use of strychnine strongly suggests a connection, but the method changed from mineral water to bicarbonate. if the poison traveled with Jane in an already contaminated bottle. It may have been planted in San Francisco. If it was added in Hawaii, then the killer either followed her or was among those traveling beside her. And think about the risk from the killer's perspective. Jane had survived once and knew exactly what bitter poison tasted like. A second dose of the same substance might immediately alert her, as it apparently did. Strychnine was not subtle once symptoms began. This suggests either desperation, limited knowledge, or confidence that a larger dose would act too quickly for rescue. Unfortunately, the surviving evidence cannot tell us which. Forensic science was also far more limited than it is today. Investigators could chemically identify strychnine, but they had no surveillance footage, electronic travel records, DNA testing, or modern methods for reconstructing who touched a bottle. Evidence handling standards varied, especially across jurisdictions separated by thousands of miles. Once the inquiry lost momentum, opportunities disappeared. Witness memories faded, objects changed hands, and institutional narratives hardened into competing versions. Jane's body was returned to California, and public ceremonies emphasized her role as Stanford's founder and benefactor. That memorial focus helped shift attention away from the disturbing circumstances in Honolulu. The university had strong reasons to project stability. Its surviving leaders needed to reassure faculty, students, donors, and the wider public. In that atmosphere, a story of natural death was far easier to manage than an unresolved murder surrounding the institution's most powerful patron. The murder investigation gradually faded. No suspect was charged, no trial examined the witnesses under oath in an adversarial courtroom, and no jury was asked to decide who placed the poison. Over time, the competing explanations became part of the case itself. One official finding said deliberate strychnine poisoning. A powerful university president said natural causes. The absence of prosecution allowed both stories to circulate, though they were not equally supported by the toxicological evidence. Modern reviews generally treat poisoning as the stronger explanation. The first bottle was laboratory tested after Jane survived. The second bottle was linked to a sudden illness displaying classic neurological signs. Honolulu physicians witnessed the final attack, and the coroner's jury explicitly found deliberate contamination. None of this identifies a murderer, but it makes an ordinary natural death extremely difficult to reconcile with the full sequence of events. Still, an unsolved case demands restraint. We cannot know precisely who handled the bottles at the crucial moments. We cannot confidently reconstruct every conversation within Jane's household or Stanford's administration, and we should not turn suspicion into certainty simply because one theory feels narratively satisfying. The clearest conclusion is narrower. Jane Stanford appears to have survived one strychnine poisoning and died from another, while the person responsible escaped identification. What remains haunting is how openly the evidence seemed to point toward murder and how quickly that conclusion lost force. Jane recognized the bitter taste, doctors saw the convulsions, chemists found the poison, a coroner's jury issued a direct finding, yet status, distance, imperfect forensics, and institutional pressure blurred the path forward. The mystery was not created by a lack of warning. Jane Stanford had already survived the warning once. On January 14th, the poison was in her water. On February 28th, it was in a bottle of bicarbonate at a hotel across the Pacific. By March 9th, an official jury had called her death deliberate. After that, certainty gave way to influence, competing explanations, and silence. More than a century later, the essential question remains unanswered. Who followed Jane Stanford's life closely enough to try twice and finally succeed? If this case stayed with you, there are others waiting. Subscribe to Silent Shadows and walk with us into the next one.